Uh, Welcome, Colin Van Ostern, who is a candidate for Congress in the second district, and may be known to quite a few people in our region. So I'm going to start with, so this is a primary election that is coming up soonest. And so you and your primary opponent seem to agree on an awful lot of things that are affecting the second district and nation. So why don't we start with why should voters choose you?
I appreciate the question, Bill. I believe really strongly that we deserve a New Hampshire leader who's in it for us, somebody who has delivered for our communities, who understands what our lives are like. And that's what I've devoted the last 20, 25 years of my life to. I have represented this area, these communities, 49 cities and towns on our state executive council. I've led some of the most innovative private sector businesses in the world that happen to be right here in New Hampshire, places like Stonyfield, Southern New Hampshire University. I've volunteered for our nonprofits and coached my kids' basketball team at Concord Parks and Rec. And I think all of those experiences, the collective weight of living a life in a community is really important to represent it. And I've seen how our most effective voices in Congress, people like Annie Kuster and Maggie Hassan and Jean Shaheen and Chris Pappas, what I see unifies them is that they really understand what our lives are like in New Hampshire, that they really, they know our communities like the back of their hand. And I think that that is going to be absolutely critical. I don't think we can afford to lose it. We've had that in Annie Kuster. I'm really proud that she has endorsed me in the race, our mayor, our state senator, in fact, every Democratic mayor in the district have all endorsed me in this effort. And part of the reason is most of us have worked together on really important issues for our communities. So I'll give you a couple of specific examples here. I ran for executive council and won and got Planned Parenthood funding restored to keep the doors open at the Keene Planned Parenthood Health Center, and it worked. I worked with Maggie Hassan and Chris Pappas to get Medicaid expansion done. I remember when we hosted one of the last council field hearings before that vote, it was a meeting that I hosted at Cheshire Medical Center. And that was a 3-2 vote. That was 10 years ago. 100,000 people in our state have gotten cheaper, better healthcare because of that, including addiction treatment services and mental health. And there's a bridge being built right now in Hinsdale that was on and off the 10-year plan since the 80s. And cars will go over it in the next year. And I remember how we got that done. I had a field hearing, talked with Ray Burton, a Republican counselor who represented the district next door. And we talked about ambulance response times over the Connecticut River when the bridge goes down and how much they're delayed. And we talked about the need to build a new industrial park after Vermont Yankee shut down. But you couldn't get modern tractor trailers over the old bridge. And we built a coalition and we got it on the 10-year plan and it's getting done now. And my point is that having an effective New Hampshire leader who knows how to deliver for us is not something we can take for granted. And that's what I offer in this race. And it's what sets me apart from the other candidates.
Okay. So then to jump into some issues, one thing that Congress members sometimes need to address is foreign relations issues. In Congress, what would your approach be to the situation in Gaza?
I see it as connected to, there's a central thread that runs through a number of our national security and foreign policy challenges that we're facing as a country right now. And I believe that thread, whether it's what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine, even some of the economic competition that we're seeing with China and in the region there in Southeast Asia, I think a lot of that comes down to the need to stand up for democracy. And this happens in subtle and nuanced ways, particularly in Israel and Palestine. What let me start here. What happened last October, on October 7th, that was a level of terrorism that is hard for us to imagine here in the United States. Israel is 30 times smaller than us. And so to think of more than 1,000 people killed, hundreds taken hostage, some hostages that are still being held today, that is a horrific incident. And I think we have to start the conversation by noting that Israel has a right to defend itself, has a right to exist, is an important ally. The people of Israel, the nation of Israel, it's an important ally of the United States. I believe that we can hold in our mind all of those beliefs and also acknowledge the humanitarian crisis since is untenable. 1 million displaced, 1 million facing famine, tens of thousands of civilians killed. This cannot continue, and we need to use the full range of diplomatic tools that we have to try to bring that to an end as soon as possible. I don't believe those two ideas are in conflict. And I'll say kind of near term and long term what I think has to happen. Near term, I believe strongly in the need for an urgent ceasefire, and one that comes with return of hostages and removal of Hamas from operational control. It is mind-numbing that there are still hostages being held today. We're starting to approach almost a year of captivity. But I don't believe ultimately that this will be solved with a military solution alone. We will only have a lasting peace with a two-state solution, I believe. And that's my point of saying that there's a central thread of democracy that runs through each of these issues. Ultimately, having the people of Israel and the people of Palestine both have representative, legitimate self-governance through democracy in a two-state solution, I think is the only long-term way to prevent people from turning to terrorism again and having the cycle of violence continue. And I'll just say one last thing, and I know it's a long answer, but I think it's an important question and a nuanced one. And it's one that, frankly, there's far too many 15-second sound bites or people trying to pit each other against each other on this issue. And I actually think most of what I just articulated, I hear from New Hampshire voters that there's a lot of common ground there. But I do want to end on this. This is not a foreign policy issue alone. There are deep and important domestic effects of what's happening right in our country itself. Early in this campaign, I met with the rabbi at our temple in Concord to hear from her about how her community is being affected. And what she told me, and what I saw myself in 3 different bar and bat mitzvahs this spring that I was attending, she said that they have had their doors locked at the temple, that for fear of security and safety, that there's real anxiety within her congregation for the level of anti-Semitism that we've seen, but that it didn't just start in October of last year, that they've had those doors closed since the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh a few years ago. And my point is, I think we need to realize that there are members of our community here in our state who are deeply personally affected by what's happening right now in Israel and Gaza. I've talked with college students on campus about this. I've talked with a friend who runs Hillel at Dartmouth, which is the Jewish students organization there. I think there are actually a lot of impacts within our own communities, and I don't view it as just a foreign policy issue alone.
Okay, I'd like to ask about immigration.
Sure.
How do you think we should address immigration at the southern border in particular, but then more broadly, the stickier issue of how do we fix what many refer to as a broken immigration system?
I love the way you asked the question, because I actually think what you just articulated as part of the key is that there are 2 issues here: border security and comprehensive immigration reform. So let me tackle both. On border security, this is overdue. Both parties have dropped the ball, but I'll say there was a bipartisan consensus about border security that was forged in the U.S. Congress last spring, and it is Donald Trump's. I mean, he said, "Blame me for this not happening." It is his fault that we don't have border security legislation today, and it wasn't perfect, but it would have meant that today someone comes across the southern border and asks for asylum. It's a 6-year, potentially a 6-year process for them to receive a hearing. That would have meant the resources so that it could have been 6 weeks instead of 6 years. That's better for every single person involved. And I am optimistic that as we get past an election year, we'd actually now have the right bipartisan support to get some level of border security legislation done. I think that I view it as distinct from comprehensive immigration reform. And I'll tell you how I think about the latter. I've managed a number of teams here in New Hampshire, and as an employer, I've had 3 different times when I've lost an employee because of a totally broken immigration system. Usually because of typos by the government on visa renewal applications. And when something like that happens, it can take months or years to get it fixed because the whole system is so backlogged and broken. And when when you are trying to grow business in New Hampshire and you lose a key employee, it is incredibly frustrating. They don't leave the country. They go home and sit at their couch until they get this resolved. You have to backfill the job. It holds the whole business back. And Washington has been talking about this for decades, and we keep hearing about this bill and this gang and that gang, and then nothing gets done. And I think people have lost patience. I think anyone who, in a state like New Hampshire, where we have relatively low employment, anyone who's struggling to have access to the high quality workforce that they need, who has faced these challenges personally, is ready for change. So I think there's some room for some bipartisan support to try to push immigration reform through that can increase our access to high quality workforce. We also have Americans who are our friends and neighbors who are living in the shadows, people who've come in here often as children, who have spent their whole lives here, who've played by the rules, who've paid taxes, and they need a pathway to citizenship. It's the only reasonable solution to this. But I think by breaking these 2 things apart, we actually will have more of a chance of making progress than by trying to do everything together.
Okay, you just touched on what leads to the next question, which is how would you deal with undocumented immigrants who are already here?
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, I think there are a lot of people in our own communities who are living in the shadows in a way that's dangerous for them and dangerous for everybody. And often we're talking about people who have effectively spent their whole life here, people who are brought here as children, who have spent sometimes decades now paying taxes, payroll taxes, playing by the rules, staying out of jail, contributing to their community. I think we do need a pathway to citizenship for people like that. It's still important they go through an orderly process. I've worked with and alongside people like that myself, and I think it's better for our communities, better for them to break this this mess that we've had of like pretending like the problem doesn't exist or complaining about it, which seems like essentially what Washington has been doing for decades now. I certainly don't believe that mass deportation or the other horrific ideas that Donald Trump has proposed are a realistic solution, and I think they would weaken our country.
Thank you.
What steps would you support to control inflation and to address the debt and the deficit? And what are your thoughts about tax policy as well?
Great question, Rick. Thank you. I tend to be pretty practical about these things. In New Hampshire, I was on the executive council for 2 terms. We reviewed billions of dollars of contract. We had a balanced budget in New Hampshire every single year. And we did big things like Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion cut the number of uninsured in New Hampshire almost in half, roughly 15% to 8% in the last decade. And none of the boogeymen that people would trot out at the time ever actually happened. We didn't end up with a sales tax. We didn't end up with an income tax. We found ways to get it done in a smart and practical way. To your question about both inflation and tax policy, we see household costs manifest in a lot of ways. Some of the ways that they hurt households the most right now are in housing. Housing prices have doubled. Mortgage rates have more than doubled. If you move across town in New Hampshire right now, you're going to pay 3 times as much as you used to. We see childcare costs that are extraordinarily out of control. Many families pay more in childcare than they do for a mortgage. These are some really big ticket items, and we see it in small ticket items too in the grocery store. there are some specific things that I've spent a lot of my life and professional work in this area on things like lowering healthcare costs, on things like lowering tuition. At SNU, we built a college for 10,000 students, most of whom got a degree with no debt at all. But I also think there are some things the federal government needs to do. I'll be very specific. We have trillions of dollars of tax cuts for the very biggest corporations, very wealthiest individuals that passed under Donald Trump. Many of those sunset next year. I believe we need to let some of those tax cuts for the very biggest corporations sunset, retire, and use that money for a combination of things, partly to cut our federal deficits. If we do that well, we'll put downward pressure on interest rates. That means lower mortgage, lower refinancing, cheaper new car. It helps a small business. My wife and I run a small business. It helps small business owners expand their business if they can access capital more cheaply. So cutting deficits isn't just abstract. It also really can drive down interest rates and help with household costs a lot. But we also need to use some of the money that we can save from those tax cuts for the very wealthiest for things that are practical that families need here in New Hampshire. Cost of housing is a good example. Right now, the median home price in New Hampshire is $560,000+. Think about what that means for a first-time home buyer. And in many communities, there are no starter homes anymore, effectively. So that means someone having $120,000 in a savings account to be able to put a down payment. That's just out of reach for too many people. And so using part of the savings for things like a first-time home buyer tax credit. That's an idea, by the way, that I heard from Tim McNamara. He's the mayor of Lebanon. He sat on the board of an organization called Twin Pine, which is an affordable housing organization in the Upper Valley. But he said in a place where they have so little access to starter homes, having a first-time homebuyer tax credit will really ease the crunch for a lot of families. So I think those are some specific ideas. I guess the last piece on housing particularly, which is often the number one element of a family's budget, is we just passed a big infrastructure bill as a country. And most of that hasn't been put to use in our communities yet. And I talked about the Hinsdale Bridge earlier as an example of where it really matters to have somebody who understands our community fight for us. There are opportunities to bring some of those infrastructure ag dollars to build out town water, town sewer. That means every new housing build can be done more cheaply if it means we can avoid septic or private wells. Having more supply and lower cost of new construction will have a dramatic impact on the housing squeeze, which is kind of the number one area that a lot of families are facing when they see higher costs right now. I'll say these are all issues that I get really passionate about, and I don't view them as political issues. I used to serve for 2 terms on the executive council. That's how I have met a few of you, but I've spent most of the last 6 or 8 years working in the private sector as a dad. I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. Most recent time I'd come to Keene before this campaign started was for a basketball tournament at Keene State that my kids were playing in. And when you sit with other parents on the sidelines of a kid's sports game, nobody wants to talk about politics at all. But you will hear really fast that someone can't get a kid off a childcare wait list because the wait lists seem like they go on forever, or someone can't move because they can't afford to move even within their own community, or their parents can't downsize because of the change in housing prices. So I think that these are areas that it's really important that we have advocates really focusing on these basic bread and butter issues for most families.
Social Security and Medicare specifically, thoughts about those?
Yeah, I have family members who are able to live because of the check they receive from Social Security right now. I think Social Security and Medicare are both, and have health insurance because of Medicare. They are an absolutely critical safety net for our country that have lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty or have avoided poverty for tens of millions of people. One of the reasons I want to make sure that we do start slashing deficits and making sure our economy is growing is because that's good for the long-term life of Social Security and Medicare. I will never support any cuts for either. I think they're absolutely critical. I think we need to be creative and thoughtful about ways to strengthen them even further and strengthen benefits even further. So I'll give you an example. Right now, the Social Security taxes cap. So an individual paying $1 million, or an individual earning $1 million a year pays the same Social Security tax as somebody earning $160,000 a year. We need to be thoughtful about not raising taxes on middle-class families. And I think there are a lot of families, even in New Hampshire, where, you know, if they're right at the cusp of that tax cap, I don't think it's appropriate to raise the cap and raise their taxes for a family earning $170,000, $180,000 a year. But there is a point where we need to kick that back in. For wealthy families, you know, people making $500,000, $700,000, $1 million a year, they should be paying a little more for Social Security taxes than a middle-class family would. That's the way our tax system works in this country. Doing that would greatly extend the strength and life of Social Security as a trust fund, but it also would mean the opportunity for stronger benefits for people.
So you're in favor of, not in favor of the cap being lifted, but
I think we need to look at kind of applying Social Security taxes for the very wealthiest income earners. Personally, I don't believe that we should be increasing taxes for middle income or upper middle income families. So the cap is kind of right in that range. So I wouldn't just remove the cap, because I think it would have a negative impact on a family earning, you know, collectively $175,000 a year. In New Hampshire, if you have kids in college and that's what you're earning, you still can be squeezed in a lot of places. But I do think for much wealthier families, it's reasonable to look at that.
do you think that alone would avoid insolvency of?
I think if we don't raid the Social Security Trust Fund, if we slash our deficits federally, which we've done before, if we have a growing economy and we make some smart moves like, yes, I think those are exactly the steps that we need to have a long-term, strong Social Security, which is really important to our country. And I should say, I know in 2024, the idea of cutting deficit sounds hard. But I remember, you know, I remember the course that we went through in the 1990s. There was a point at which we thought this was impossible too, and we actually got to budget surpluses when I was in college. That wasn't that long ago. The way you do it is you be fiscally responsible, which we know how to do here in New Hampshire, and you have to have a growing economy. It takes both, but if you do both well, we have that opportunity again, and we need to, it's worth putting effort into.
So Colin, you mentioned childcare a couple times there. Obviously, an issue for many families in New Hampshire, but there's kind of a I guess a zero-sum effect there. How do you reduce the cost of childcare for families, but make sure that childcare workers are making enough to get by themselves?
The biggest challenge we have in childcare right now is that there aren't enough childcare workers. And the reason there aren't enough is generally because it doesn't pay enough. For a lot of families, it's difficult to decide to go do a job when you're getting paid so little that you can stay home with your kids yourself, and it makes more financial sense. So I think there are some kind of micro and macro ways to tackle this. At the macro level, one of the things I fought for in our state government was expanding full-day kindergarten. I think we need to take the next step forward, look at universal pre-K, and look at how the federal government can use some of those savings from the Trump tax cuts to help support communities that will pay for pre-K, for universal pre-K. It's not a full solution, but it's one of the ways is to extend public school as one way to help with early childhood education. On the micro level, one of the projects I was involved in the last couple of years, I joined the board of something called the Biofabrication Coalition here in New Hampshire. It's a public-private partnership for Southern New Hampshire. When the state was awarded a Build Back Better grant around the biotech industry that Dean Kamen's research shop is working on, manufactured cells, tissue, and organs. And there's so much commercial promise there that first Manchester and now Manchester and Nashua were awarded a national designation for how do you build out a whole new industry. And this is a little bit of an aside, but bear with me. I'll bring it back to childcare because it's one of the big things we focused on. That team put together an application just a few months ago. We got awarded one of 10 tech hub grants in the entire country. And the idea is where there is a geographic hub around an industry critical to national security, in this case, biofabrication is exactly that. The US Chamber of Commerce came here, Gina Raimondo, and she said, we need to make sure what happens with biofabrication isn't what happened with chips and semiconductors, where the whole industry moved to Taiwan. We have to be building this out domestically. So what our board was charged with is, how do you do that? How do you build an industry with thousands of new jobs? And our focus is things like workforce development, transportation systems. And one of the big projects that we applied for in this Tech Hubs grant, it was a $44 million grant. Almost $10 million of it is for building out quality childcare pathways in Southern New Hampshire. So it's going to include apprenticeship programs where we not just create tuition-free models at places like local community colleges, but actually will pay students to earn early childhood credentials, making it be a little more cost advantageous for them to go into the industry. One of the ideas that is still idea stage, but it's been pioneered in a few other states, and I think there's a lot of promise, is essentially childcare vouchers for childcare workers themselves. Because there's a multiplying effect here where if somebody can ensure that if they work in the industry, their own kids get free childcare too, then it increases the access of workforce, and it's another form of compensation to incent more people to work in that industry. We found that was one of the big barriers that we have to break down. If you're going to create 7, 8, 9,000 new jobs in Southern New Hampshire, it will not work unless we have enough people with lab tech degrees, unless we have enough childcare spots, unless we have enough transportation infrastructure so people can get to and from those jobs.
So at the federal level, how do you start making this happen?
So in that case, it was a grant for what's effectively a pilot project. I have enough of a background in the private sector that I believe in measurement. I think you need to measure what the outcomes are. That is one Tech Hub program. There are 10 others or 9 others across the country right now. But we need to actually measure, like, what is our childcare capacity? How long are our wait lists? How much does it change? But where we see promise, I think there's a lot of promise to federally funded apprenticeship programs for childcare. And if we can prove that the ROI is positive for the community, I think that's the sort of thing that can be expanded beyond a pilot project, that can be like with Head Start, that there can be new federal programs that really help support our communities more broadly.
You touched on affordable housing earlier and seemed to indicate that supply, if it's done fairly affordably, could create more affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as you're aware, in the 2nd district, homelessness has become a big issue, as it has in other cities across the US. So what would be your solution for the unhoused?
I do think housing supply is a big part of it. It's not the solution alone, but I've met with housing advocates throughout the district, up in Littleton at AHEAD, which is a community nonprofit up there, in Lebanon with the mayor, in Nashua with folks at NeighborWorks. And one of the things I hear is it's a little bit like a waterbed, where if you kind of push on just workforce housing, then it tends to create issues with middle-class housing or affordable housing, that you kind of have to address all of this in order to have the sufficient supply be available. There are some federal supports for new construction. So in Lebanon, I toured 2 low-income housing communities. One that just got a refurbished entirely through the USDA program, weatherization, which can keep cost downs for residents. There's another one that they're working to make it a net zero carbon platform at the housing community there. But I think if we only focus on supply, then we're also going to leave a few things unaddressed. I mentioned the fight that I took on a Medicaid expansion, which took a lot of work from others as well, but we have to address sufficient access to behavioral and mental health care coverage, and addiction and substance use disorder, which are problems that often plague individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And we need to acknowledge also that often their first opportunities for either being diverted from becoming homeless in the first place or getting out of homelessness tend to be rental properties. And we've seen a lot of bad actors, bad faith, and discriminatory practice within rental properties. So one of the pillars of my housing plan is to end source of income discrimination in rental properties. Another is to take on some of the junk fees that we see, and another junk fees that, like, most of us notice through airline tickets or something like that. It's happening more and more in rental properties, where you think the rent is this much, and then there's an application fee, and then there's this, and there's that, and you end up paying much more than you thought it would be. But I also think we need to look seriously at capping for any large landlord. If they're getting federal tax benefits, they should not be able to increase rent more than 5% a year. And so some of those things can keep the cost down. And I mentioned diversion. There are some rapid support programs right now that help individuals who are right at the edge of homelessness, help them get into short-term rental housing, try to kind of prevent that first step from happening, that have proven to be pretty successful. I think those are areas that probably deserve some more investment. My wife and I own a laundry services company in Manchester called Wash Street. It's a laundromat and a wash and fold delivery company. And I think there are 12 or 13 employees. Kristen runs it, my wife. But some of the employees came up with the idea of a free laundry night for the homeless community. It started a year and a half ago. Often we do free dinner as well. And one of the reasons they came up with the idea is because a number of her employees have themselves experienced homelessness, or several of whom are in recovery as well. And, you know, I think that when you, well, a year before those started, I was coaching my kids' basketball team at Concord Parks and Rec, and the Orange Dragons in 4th grade. One of his teammates on the Orange Dragons was there a year and a half later for one of those free laundry for the homeless nights with his mom. And I think it's really important in this conversation to acknowledge that these are our friends and neighbors and community members. It's tempting and easy to talk about people who are experiencing homelessness as other, but when you have one of your kids' teammates show up for free dinner and free laundry, it really drives home how, you know, we are our brother's keepers. And I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that.
So, Colin, in this election, as is often the case, there are culture battles being waged, as well as political and economic ones. So there's a movement, I think, in parts of our country to roll back protections for the LGBTQ population. And this time around, it seems to be largely aimed at trans individuals and gender issues. We've certainly seen it in New Hampshire over the past couple of years. What's Congress' role in trying to navigate that, and what in Congress would you advocate for in terms of maintaining or increasing protections, or is that even the step that should be taken?
I think it is. I think Congress has two roles here. One role is to make sure that our anti-discrimination laws appropriately protect the, you know, full range of folks who are being targeted right now. So that includes not just sexual orientation and identity, but, you know, all of the different ways that we have seen these, you know, political attacks and what I think of as wedge issue attacks, you know, come after members of our own community. We've seen it in Concord, where I live. And so I do think that there's room to have better federal protection, but I also think, frankly, part of the job is to resist the political BS that has arisen recently. Like, these are purely political attacks meant to divide us from each other. There is not a debate in most of our communities about how to do this. Like, we include kids in kids sports. It is not that complicated. I have seen it be a transformative, positive experience for my kids to learn teamwork and discipline and hard work. And the idea that anyone would be excluded from that for a 4th grade team, a 5th grade team, an 8th grade team, whatever it is, it just makes no sense. And people try to pick out these edge cases or extreme examples to try to scare people. But I have found in our communities, actually, there is overwhelming common ground that we need to be inclusive, that we need to ensure that our children have access to sports, and that there's, just in Concord, there's a cafe called Teetotaler. And a teetotaler, literal neo-Nazis came last summer and marched outside. And I'm not saying figuratively neo-Nazis. I know that sometimes in politics terms are thrown around too much. I mean, they identify as neo-Nazis. They are doing Sig Heil salutes, and they were there to harass individuals who were inside based on what they were wearing or how their sexual or preferences or what their identity was. That is not a tough debate in New Hampshire. We don't want any part of it. Like, that sort of harassment has no place in our communities. And I don't think we should treat this as a political debate where we're, 55% of the people believe one thing and 45% believe the other. I actually believe there's overwhelming common ground in our communities that we should accept people for who they are, who they love. And New Hampshire was one of the national leaders in adopting marriage equality. And we are the live free or die state. Even across political parties, I think there's a very strong belief that we need to be accepting of our fellow community members, especially when it comes to kids and kids in sports.
What would you do with the Affordable Care Act and fixing healthcare?
I mean, I was a strong advocate for a public option when we first were debating the Affordable Care Act. I think it was a real miss when Senator Lieberman stripped that out of the bill. I think that's true because there are just too often times that private health insurance, I think, can verge on the edge of predatory. Most of us as consumers have experienced it. I have spent hours and hours and hours I will never get back in my life on the phone with health insurance companies trying to get routine things, denial of coverage reversed for just routine coverage that felt like it was denied just because that's the health insurance business model. I do think that the choice of having private insurance as an option is an important thing for Americans. And the reason I have supported the public option, I think it needs to be back on the table today, is because it gives people the option of having a Medicare-like coverage or being able to choose private insurance if it's what they want. I also think it builds on the successes of the Affordable Care Act. It's easy to talk about it now in 2024 about the successes, but I remember when we had to get it passed. It was a tough debate. It was, and look, when I represented this area for 2 terms on the executive council, I was the Democratic nominee for governor in 2016. I took millions of dollars of attack ads in the face for quote unquote trying to make Obamacare permanent. Now, the punchline is 10 years later, it's actually quite popular. And even when Republicans have held control of the legislature, executive council, and governor's office, they have kept the Medicaid expansion that myself and Chris Pappas and Maggie Hassan helped get done in the first place. But there were plenty of attacks for it at the time. We have cut the number of uninsured in our state dramatically. I think from about 15 to about 10% of the people in New Hampshire, or excuse me, from about 15% were uninsured before Medicaid expansion to now about 8%. That's a huge step forward. But if we can add a public option to the Affordable Care Act, I think it takes one of the necessary steps forward. If we can make sure that the coverage that we do offer includes the right levels of healthcare, I think that will be important as well. I'm a strong advocate for reproductive rights. I think it's important that we don't exclude the full range of reproductive rights from Medicaid healthcare coverage, as an example. And I think we need to make sure that we're, through the COVID years, we effectively kept people if they were enrolled, we would keep them enrolled. And we've now reverted to having people get opted out unless they want to opt back in for the coverage. And we've started to see the number of uninsured go up in New Hampshire again. That's a mirage. It doesn't actually save you money. It just means more people show up at an ER without coverage, and then they're given healthcare as uncompensated care, and the costs get passed on to everybody else. It's actually much better to be aggressive about making sure that we have uncovered people included in Medicaid expansion. So I think that's one of the technical changes we could make to go back to, you know, erring on the side of including people in healthcare coverage rather than erring on the side of opting them out.
What needs to happen on the national level to turn the tide on the opioid epidemic?
A lot. It's, you know, beyond opioids, it's gone to, you know, fentanyl, and even meth now are extraordinary problems. Actually, some of the things we talked about earlier are important, like better border security at the southern border. I mentioned, I think both parties have dropped the ball on getting this done. And part of the problem is we do have a lot of drugs flow over our southern border. We also have a lot of drugs coming through the mail. An extraordinary amount of that is manufactured in China. It is a very difficult problem to solve, because once addiction takes hold, it's very difficult to win that fight consistently. But good addiction care services to limit demand is part of it. Better border security. I think there are ways that we can get more aggressive with China and some of our diplomatic and trade arrangements to put more pressure on them to stem drugs from coming over the border. Often it goes from China to Mexico here, or directly in the mail. I think both of those are areas that we need to attack to limit supply as well. You know, I think a lot of these issues I have found are actually fairly interconnected. Some of the conversation we had about homelessness. I remember when I was executive counselor, I met a young man named Dante at a church basement. I think it was off Route 12. And he told me about how he started with pills and then graduated to much, much worse. And that he started just living on friends' couches and then eventually found that he was homeless. Those two issues are really deeply intertwined. And so I do think that kind of tackling mental and behavioral health care, addiction treatment services, the homelessness epidemic, housing crisis, and some of our border security, like, you can't do just one or the other. All of these things are connected. And I'll say, I think it really matters to have a member of Congress who knows how these issues are affecting our communities, who sees personally and has for years how these issues are interconnected. And I literally remember thinking about Dante as we got the Medicaid expansion fight done. It was a big debate. It was one of those, like, Chris Sununu was advocating that we do not move forward with Medicaid expansion on the final vote. It was a 3-2 vote. And he was using every sort of Washington playbook answer that you would have. Like, oh, we haven't had enough time. It's a really big contract. Just give us 2 more weeks. We need to read the bill more fully. And he knew it was September. It was the end of the fiscal year. If he could push it off a little bit, the money would dry up, and then we'd have to wait till the next election. And maybe there'd be different control in Congress or in the governor's office. And I remember thinking, like, there's no way I'm going to let Dante down. There's no way that we are going to let this delayed. And ultimately in that debate, I said, like, look, take however long time you need to read this. We will table this until tonight. We will stay here until the end of the week. You tell us how long you need to read this contract, and then we're going to vote on it. And finally, Chris said, look, I'm going to vote against it anyway. Let's just vote. And we voted, and it was a 3-2 vote, and we won. And 10 years later, 100,000 people have better healthcare coverage. And that conviction is what matters when you represent people. And the conviction comes from knowing our communities and carrying these stories with you.
My last question is going to be about the Supreme Court.
Sure.
I just read a Pew Center research survey result that says about 51% of Americans have an unfavorable view of our Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And I think most of that survey surrounded the view that the Supreme Court has become political in its decision-making, but there are also questions of ethics.
Yes.
So what should Congress do, if anything?
We definitely need to take action. I think I held hearings and confirmed 26 or 27 judges in New Hampshire when I was on the executive council. Every judge, every judicial confirmation hearing that I participated in came to a judge that came through an independent judicial selection commission process that Governor Hassan and other governors before her had implemented. It's the sort of step that matters a lot, and it's the sort of accountability that we have just lost in Washington. And the truth is, our Constitution is based on an accountability system of checks and balances. Even our 4th and 5th graders learn about this. Right now, the Supreme Court is acting as if they are accountable to nobody. That is not how our framers envisioned it. It's not how our system is supposed to work. And when you have a branch of government that is acting unaccountable, it is time for the other branches of government to remind them that they are accountable. Here's what Congress can do right now. We need to have 18-year term limits for the US Supreme Court. Every president should have 2 nominations over the course of a 4-year term. The problems have been much more egregious on the Republican side recently, in terms of some of the judges that have, confirmation hearings that either have not happened for a year or have been rushed through in the final weeks before an election. But the truth is, even justices themselves of both parties have been timing their retirements for political reasons for decades now. The last time a justice retired not for health reasons with a politician of the other party in control of the presidency was Thurgood Marshall. So let's understand that everyone has been acting that way a little bit and make some structural changes to prevent it. So having staggered 18-year terms would do exactly that. The proposal President Biden has put forward is structured in a way that would not require a US constitutional amendment. It would take an act of Congress, signature by the president, and we would have a Supreme Court that starts to have some accountability. We already have something called the Judicial Conference that has code of ethics for other court systems in our country, but it does not include the US Supreme Court. Congress can instruct the Judicial Conference to start including the US Supreme Court as well. And there's one last thing. I think we need to take a serious look at the total number of justices on the Supreme Court. It is not fixed at 9 in our Constitution. And a quirky tie-in to New Hampshire, actually, when FDR was president and some of the elements of the New Deal were first being adopted, the US Supreme Court ruled several of them to be unconstitutional. And FDR came out in a fireside chat and he proposed that for every justice over the age of 70, a new justice would be added to the court. And the tie to New Hampshire is we actually have a 70-year retirement age mandatory here in New Hampshire in our court system. But the punchline here is it never actually happened. Once he proposed that, the court, all of a sudden, the next couple elements of the New Deal were ruled constitutional. And that is part of how our accountability is supposed to work in our government, is that if you have one branch that is acting unaccountable and getting too far off the rails, it is incumbent on the other branches to take some action and find a way through compromise and disagreement and elections and consequences and legislation to get things back to where the American people want. I think that the American people want a Supreme Court they can have trust and faith in again, but they don't today. They don't because, I'm 45 years old. For 42 of those years, women had certain fundamental rights. The US Supreme Court stripped them away throughout decades of precedents for a decision that all of us saw was obviously political. And that's why people have lost faith. So we need to take some steps. That doesn't mean it'll be a Supreme Court that all Democrats will love or all Republicans will love, but we need to have a more independent judiciary than we have today. Sure.
Colin, and one of your platform issues is campaign reform, and among that, you say you would like to limit gerrymandering with independent redistricting, but is that something that Congress could even act on? Isn't that up to the states to redistrict?
It is up to the states to set their own system. Some states have started to move towards independent redistricting. However, I think for federal offices as opposed to state offices, Congress has much more ability to instruct states on, what are the appropriate mechanisms to consider redistricting. In New Hampshire, I represented what ended up being probably one of the most famously gerrymandered districts in modern state history. People called it the Dragon District. And I'm sure that independent redistricting model would have produced a much better community of interest in the map. In New Hampshire, our 2 congressional seats are actually not that gerrymandered, which is great. The 2 are both pretty competitive. This district I'm running in is a very purple district. I'm actually the only Democrat who hasn't represented us in Congress or as governor who's ever won this district before. It's a pretty purple place. So I think the gerrymandering that's hurt us the most in New Hampshire is at the state level, not the federal level. And I do think that would require some state action in order to ensure independent redistricting reform for our state offices. But there are other states where this is a huge, especially the big states like Texas, New York. These are places where, you know, there's so many seats that they can do to congressional districts what we have done effectively in New Hampshire with our state offices. And I think that, you know, finding new ways to encourage independent redistricting reform, even in some of those larger states for federal office, would be important for our overall politics. There are other things I get passionate about too. Ranked choice voting, I think, is really interesting. They've implemented it in Maine and Alaska with some positive effect. I also am deeply concerned about the amount of outside money in politics. And I will say about the amount of outside money in this race. I've gotten half a dozen super PAC mailings from billionaire funded super PACs that are doing this specifically to help my primary opponent in this race. The vast majority of the money I have raised in this campaign is from the people of New Hampshire, but I'm unique in this primary in that regard. And I do think those are the sorts of things that we need to take a good hard look at. Cracking down, overturning Citizens United, cracking down on better disclosure for outside spending. These are things I've always been passionate about. I actually went to every Democratic Party platform hearing in the state about 5 or 6 years ago and successfully lobbied for our state party platform to include independent redistricting as one of our party values for the first time ever. And those sorts of things take some time sometimes to get done, but they are the sort of structural things we need to fix within our politics.
Is there a point at which freedom of speech should be limited? If so, how would you approach it?
Well, I mean, the court certainly has ruled that there are some reasonable limits on it around times like public safety, like screaming fire in a crowded theater, I think is the kind of obvious example that we've all learned. I tend to really take the words live free or die seriously. And I think in most circumstances, I err on the side of trying to find ways towards further liberty. I think that there is speech that makes me angry, that makes my blood boil, that I still want to stay legal. And I did not think that I wasn't at the incident that I described at Teetotaler Cafe, so it's hard for me to describe exactly personally. I think it really did border on harassment, and there was some ability of like preventing people from getting in and out of the building, for example, where people do start to feel for their personal safety. But at the end of the day, if someone is a neo-Nazi and wants to show off that level of hatred, I think it's an unfortunate thing that it happens, but I actually think it's good when our community sees it and rallies against it and says this isn't who we are and what we stand for. So I generally err on the side of, even when I have a strong disagreement, I think people should be able to put their views out there, and it's a healthy part of our democracy for a community to come together and reject those views.
And should Congress be more active in, for instance, in the social media world, controlling things there or not? Yeah,
that's a great, it's not even really a side issue to this. It's becoming central. Anyone who has a 10 or 11 and 13-year-old thinks about this a lot. There's well-documented correlation between teen mental health and social media usage, particularly among young girls. And I think the tech companies have gotten away with almost no regulation around this. Where I would err is that I think that platforms should be, when platforms are passive, they should be treated more like publishers, meaning people should be able to publish things online, even if the platform doesn't support or agree with what's being published. But when they use algorithms to amplify that content, I think they take on much more responsibility. It's more central to the product of more of a product than a platform. That when they're essentially taking some of that horrible imagery that's causing depression or suicidal ideation or other mental anxiety problems, and they're pushing it out actively to millions and millions of young people. I think that we should view that a little closer to a company that is making a faulty product, because that really is their product, is their distribution system, not just their publishing platform, if that makes sense. So I think there's more definitely more action that we need to take there. It's a fraught issue because it's really important that we don't enable, you know, I have concern that if we over-regulate there, aggressive attorney general in a state that really wants to crack down on LGBTQ expression might use that as a way to prevent, folks from talking about their lifestyle or their identity online. And I don't think we got to be very careful of not allowing that. But the mental health toll on our kids is real, and the algorithm boosting is causing enough of a problem that I do think some of the regulation we've started to see is overdue.
Well, I think that's about all the questions that we had. Is there
Okay.
anything else you'd like to say before we let you go?
I guess I would just, two things on my end. One is I want to end the conversation where I think you started it in your first question. Voters have an important choice on September 10th and again in November. And there are some things that set me apart in this field. I think it is incredibly important that we have a New Hampshire leader who knows how to deliver for us and who really is in it for us, who knows our communities. And I mean that in the full spectrum of what community is, has led our businesses, has represented cities and towns, has volunteered for our nonprofits. Like, spending decades of your life doing that helps you be a strong representative. And I hope that has come through in some of the stories that I've told and the questions that you've had and kind of how I think about these issues. I think it really makes a difference of being an effective member of Congress if you know what to fight for and when to compromise, but when not to, or how to work with somebody across the aisle because you have a shared life experience, or there's a community that you represent that mirrors theirs. And like Ray Burton and I fought for rural areas to get a bridge rebuilt. I think those things matter. I hope that's part of what came through in the conversation. And the other thing, I don't know your process, but I will say, for those of you who are part of the consideration, I'm here to ask for your endorsement as well. I have worked hard to be a strong advocate for this community. And should you guys, as a newspaper, decide to make an endorsement in the race, I'm asking for your support in this. I'm really proud about the grassroots support that we're building in the race. Our congresswoman, every single mayor in the district, the vast majority of state legislators all across the district, every single labor union that has endorsed in the race has endorsed me. And I think the reason is because we've been working for, not because we agree with everyone or agree with each other on everything, but because we've seen over the decades how hard some of these fights are, what progress looks like, what it doesn't look like, and we've been in some of these fights together. And if some of the stories that I have told are ones that you've thought about, that you've experienced in your community, that you think we need a strong New Hampshire leader to be an advocate for us for, then I'm asking for your support. Thank you.